So what are those fundamental principles that the popes talk about in their encyclicals, and that make the basis of Catholic social teaching? Well, we already talked about the first one, which is human dignity, right? The fundamental dignity of the human person. So every single person is valuable as an individual, as they are, and their dignity deserves to be protected and deserves to be upheld just by nature of being human. The second part of that, oftentimes in our world, gets juxtaposed with that, which is the need for community. And a lot of times people fight the difference between community and individualism, right? Where either you're part of a community and that community determines who you are, or you are an individual and you fight for your individual rights. But really, these two things are part of the same thing, right? We are made in the image of God, which means in some ways we're like the Trinity, right? We are a group, and yet we are individuals. We are one, and yet we are one as a group, right? And so one of the goals of Catholic social teaching is to foster that sense of community in every group of people around the world, and to really think about that common good, the fact that we're not islands, but that we are connected to each other. And so that will come up often about how can we foster that role, both for individuals but also for the common good, and how can we look out for each other's common good, right? Which brings us to the third key principle, which is rights and responsibilities. So it's not only about human rights, it's also about human responsibility, so that we individually look out for the people around us, right? And for the community to function correctly, everybody has to take ownership of it. And so that's the third piece, is that every individual has rights by nature of having dignity, a human dignity based on being in the image of God, right? So all of this kind of builds on each other. And with that comes the responsibility to take care of the creation that God has put into your care, and to take care of yourself and the other individuals that are part of your community that work together for the common good, right? So it just keeps building on each other. So now the next one is a really important one, and that's what we call the preferential option for the poor, which means that Christ in a way has a preferential option for the poor, right? He chose to be poor. He chose to live with the poor and to serve the poor, and to be poor, even though he could have chosen any other way of saving the world. He decided to come into a low-income household, right? To be rejected, to be despised, and to suffer, right? To be vulnerable, even when that vulnerability led to great harm to himself. So we as a church are looking out for the poor, right? There's a great saint of the early church who was pressured by the emperor to show him the treasures of the church, and I think it was Saint Irenaeus. He gathered some poor people and said, "Look, here's the treasure of the church. The treasure of the church is the poor." And so, what does that mean to say Christ has a preferential option? And what does that mean for us, right? It means that we are looking at the poor not as a problem, but as part of us, and a valuable part of our community that we reach out to, right? There's a sense in which, with this preferential option for the poor, we say, if you have 2 coats and your neighbor has none, you have a coat that belongs to the poor, right? So it's not the Robin Hood principle of like, oh, well, that person has a coat and they should give it to the poor. It's, I have an extra coat, so I'm going to give it to the poor. I'm going to give it to someone who doesn't have a coat. So it's, again, that kind of looking out for the common good of the other. Well, who is your neighbor, right? It's the one who needs help, right? Or it's the one who helps you. And so looking out for the poor and for the vulnerable is a huge piece of Catholic social teaching. The fifth is participation and subsidiarity. I really like the principle of subsidiarity, and by the way, I'm going to share these 10 principles with you in the email that I'll send with all this, so you'll be able to follow along here. You can follow along with it right now if you'd like. So participation and subsidiarity, what does that mean? Well, it means that all of us have a part to play, right? And that part shouldn't be taken over by a larger, more powerful entity, right? So you'd think that since we have these popes writing these big encyclicals, the idea is that the Pope gives us a solution and then everybody else just bows down to it, and that's what we do. But it's actually not that way. The Pope kind of gives us, when he writes an encyclical, he gives us kind of an overarching view of the picture of the problem and of the solution, right, or the direction that we want to take. But that's not going to respond to the needs of your personal, of your individual community, of your maybe not even of your country, right? But certainly not of the reality that you encounter in your community every single day. So subsidiarity means that you don't have a larger entity do what a smaller entity can do, right? So if there's a problem within an individual and the family can respond to that problem effectively, then the family should respond to the problem, not the government, right? And the nuclear family should do so before the extended family, right? If the extended family can step in, they should. If they can't, right, if it's a larger problem than that, then maybe there does need to be an outside organization, a local organization, or maybe even a government system to step in. But you don't have a larger entity do what a smaller entity can handle, right? And in that sense, everybody is participating in the good of society, in the good of the church and of the community as a whole, and that participation also means that then those in need or those who are vulnerable are lifted up rather than just continued to be put down. Right? The idea is that they also should find, and we also, when we're in a vulnerable position, should have a participation, right, an active part in the good, in the common good of the whole, of all of us. And that kind of goes to the next piece, which is the dignity of work and the rights of worker. So the dignity of work, again, takes us back to point one, the fundamental dignity of the human person. And that might seem strange, you know, we think of work as that thing that we have to do so we make money sometimes, but that's not really what work is, right? Sometimes it doesn't even, and sometimes we think of the thing that's just really hard and that we don't enjoy, but that's part of work. Part of work now is toil, right? The fact that we have to toil by the sweat of our brow, but fundamentally, work is something that we have had with us since we were created in our original holiness, right? So God says, right after he makes us male and female in his own image, he says to all of us, fill the world and subdue it, be fruitful and multiply, right? So we are to go out and subdue the world, to have dominion over the world, to be fruitful, to be multiplied, to multiply. And all of that involves work, right? It involves us taking the creation that we have received and making more of it, right? Making new things with it. And any work that we do, even a video like this, right, is creating something that wasn't there before. So part of the way that we are created in the very image of God is that God is creator and we are creating, right? We are creating now that we have been created. And so we use our gifts, we use our skills, we use our talents. And in doing so, we're not just providing for ourselves, we're actually exercising the very nature that God has given us. We're actually realizing that for which we were made, right? To be co-creators with God. And so the dignity of work means that people should have work, right? And to have dignified work, right? And to have work in which they can participate in this co-creating act, right? And so the economy should be there for the worker, not just the worker for the economy. And that gets complicated, right? Because when you get into economics, you get into politics, and we might talk about that in a little bit here. But the point is that work is a fundamental part of what it is to be human, and it's a fundamental part of, it's a fundamental area where our dignity can be attacked, right? Either by working without just pay, right, to the point of no pay at all, right? Slavery is certainly an affront in many different ways to human dignity, but that participation of the worker in their creation, in the creation around them, is a really important piece, and there are certain rights that come with that, and so one of the things that Catholic social teaching talks about is how do we respond to affronts to the dignity of the worker and the rights of the worker. So we can talk about that a little bit more later, but the fundamental principle is that work is a good thing. It's a part of how we express our being made in the image of God. Right? The other half of that, work to create a new thing, the other part of that is stewardship. It's taking care of the creation that has been given to us, right? And now we are in a world where it is not only the creation of God, but also centuries and centuries, millennia of the co-creation of other human beings that has been entrusted in our care. Right? And so the stewardship of creation is part of having dominion over creation. So Pope Francis sent out an encyclical that's considered a part of Catholic social teaching. It's called Laudato Si, which means praise be. It's based on a St. Francis song. But the whole focus of it was care for our common home, care for the environment. Right? Now, and that's an interesting example of one of the things that he does is that he talks about care for our common home in a variety of places in the world, in Africa, in more developed parts of the world, and it talks about the different challenges that care for our common home is facing in these different parts of the world, right? So a lot of times when we hear about these issues in the news, we receive them more localized. We receive them about the particular world view or the particular world, the part of the world that we're living in our little sector, right? But something that's kind of overarching, like a papal encyclical, can touch on different areas that we wouldn't necessarily consider otherwise. So stewardship of creation is a really big part of what it means to live out the principles of Catholic social teaching. Is yes, we as human beings have a fundamental dignity, but all of creation has that dignity of being created by the Father, right? We are co-creators, which gives us a special place in creation, but all of creation has a special place, and we could not co-create if there weren't already a creation for us to care for. So those are, that's another fundamental principle that connects with a whole bunch of other things. Right? So solidarity, these next three are actually less, the first seven that I mentioned are kind of considered like the seven fundamental principles. The last three are solidarity, role of government, and promotion of peace. And they all kind of build off of those other things, right? Solidarity means that we stand with the people around the world and recognize that actually community extends, even though we have this bottom-up development, right? We also are a universal church and are looking and caring for the neighbors on the other side of the globe who might be affected by things differently than we are. So this idea that we are a global community, right? Role of government, well, the main role of government is to protect the rights of the citizens, right? The human dignity, and to build the common good. Now, what that looks like, what your ideal role, version of government is, you might not find the exact answer in Catholic social teachings. And it's not saying that there is only one form of government that the Catholic Church could endorse, but what is the point, right? What is government trying to fix? So even though Catholic social teaching isn't political, isn't fundamentally political, it certainly has a real political component to it, which is this government, whichever type it is, fulfilling its role of upholding and promoting the human dignity of every single person that they are responsible for. Right? So areas where that comes into play could be things like migration, right? We already talked about the fact that in the Old Testament already, God is looking out for the orphan, the widow, and the stranger, right? The foreigner, because if you're a foreigner, you are necessarily vulnerable. There are so many things that you can take for granted if you're in your homeland that you do not have rights and access to if you're not in your homeland. So the right to migrate, right? If you are in a situation where your government is corrupt, where you're under threat, to be able to move, right? We've seen that throughout history that people have done that. On the other hand, where are you migrating from and why? Right? So if you're living in a place like in many parts of Central America where people are fleeing from to come to us now, they are leaving because the government is failing in their responsibility to promote the dignity of the people living in their countries, right? And so it again becomes a complicated issue that goes a little bit beyond politics, because you say, well, yes, people should have the right to migrate, but they should also have the right not to migrate, right? And to live in a society where their personal dignity is protected and is upheld. And I have worked with some of those people in from Central America, and you can just tell that they have never expected any kind of protection from their government because they've never received it. So there again, we see things become more complicated. It's not like the church has a quick, easy answer for every social issue, but it has a direction and a solution towards which it's pointing. And that solution, the last of these 10 that I have on this list, is the promotion of peace, right? There's, which has to do with politics again, right? If your country is in a state of war or civil war, your fundamental dignity is at risk, but also your relationship with other people. There's a need for a promotion of peace within that. So ultimately, issues of social justice and social problems all have an element of a lack of peace, right? Whether it's just a small disagreement between husband and wife or a large societal problem, there's a lack of peace, and so we need the Prince of Peace to come in, and the fruit of peace is, and so peace is a fruit of justice, right? They belong together. So, and that brings me kind of to the last of my many points, which will take us back to that personal the personal moral life that we skipped over, that we're going to get back to next week or so, which is love and the virtues. So all of Catholic social teaching is based on a fostering of love and the virtues, right? That's where everything went wrong to begin with anyway, right? The fact that we individually decided to go wrong, we individually decided to sin, and things unraveled then to the point to where now we have systemic injustice, we have structural issues, systemic evils, right? Like even just to go back to the situation in certain countries in Central America, you have systemic problems now that start with individual issues, right? And what the church teaches is we're looking for peace and justice, and those things come through a promotion of the virtues in our own life and a fostering of the virtues in our own lives. So you can't set the world in order if you don't have your room clean, so to speak. And so virtues such as patience and temperance, right, and self-control and courage, all of these things are required both within our own life and in society as a whole to promote the justice that is lacking in so many places. When we get back to talking about the virtues and the love that inspires all virtues, think back to talking about the social dimensions about that as well, because they're not separate issues, they are connected.